Ukraine turned the direction of its attacks to the historical peninsula of the Black Sea. In recent days, Ukrainian drones have frequently flown over the Crimean skies. In addition to drone attacks, long-range missiles and sabotage actions brought the tension in the peninsula to its peak. Crimea is seen as the key to ending the Ukraine war. For this reason, attacks on the peninsula are gaining momentum. What is happening in Crimea, which carries the flag of independence in Ukraine's freedom struggle? Huge explosions occurred on the main railway line in the city of Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, yesterday. As a result of the explosion, 8 Russian military wagons were derailed. 50 meters of the track was damaged. A 1.5 meters long crater was formed under the tracks. The movement of electric trains in the Simferopol-Sevastopol section is suspended, according to Oleg Kryachkov, the so-called advisor to the president of Crimea. Passengers will be transported to the necessary stations by buses. As is known, Crimea is critical for Moscow's control over the occupied territories in southern and eastern Ukraine and plays a role in the supply of Russian troops. An explosion on railroad tracks in Crimea disrupted the delivery of supplies and weapons to the Kremlin's Black Sea Fleet, including Caliber cruise missiles. Simferopol train line also goes as far as Russia's Krasnodar Oblast and connects to Taman port. Military freight trains are of critical importance for logistics because it's the only option for transporting high-tonnage military ammunition and weapons. The attack on this critical line in Simferopol severely disrupted the Russians' defense and logistics of Crimea. Also, Crimea has hosted numerous attacks in recent weeks, including multiple drone attacks on the region's largest city, Sevastopol, in the northern part of the peninsula. Ukrainian drones attacked the Russian airport of Xi'an-Koi, the Russian railway line and military depot in Maslova, and the Russian Navy base in Sevastopol. The common purpose of these attacks may be to disrupt the logistics with the Kherson region by neutralizing the Russian logistics network in the north of Crimea. The explosion of the Simferopol train line in Crimea, the drone attack of the Russian warship in the Black Sea, the blowing up of the Russian supply lines and oil depots near the Kerch Bridge are crossing Putin's red lines and cornering them. Russian residents of the peninsula are waiting for an opportunity to flee in fear and panic. The Russian authorities in Crimea, on the other hand, are in a state of serious panic. Although the Crimean Peninsula is the most strategic region of the Black Sea, it's home to 2.5 million people. While the Russians make up 58% of the population of Crimea, Ukrainians 24%, and Crimean Tatars 12%. Other ethnic groups also live there. About 1 million of the Russians living on the peninsula are illegally resettled to the peninsula after the annexation of Crimea. On the other hand, the fear of the Ukrainian armed forces causes Russian soldiers to flee from Crimea. The evacuation of Russian headquarters in Crimea and the evacuation of Russian military families. Last month, the Russian-backed military authorities of Crimea announced the evacuation of Russian military families from the peninsula. It was a sharp move unleashed by a great anxiety and fear. It was also an indication that the Russians could not cope with the Ukrainian attacks. The evacuation of Russian headquarters outside of the Crimea in the past weeks was also a vivid symbol of the uneasiness of the Russians. In this week's update, UK intelligence revealed a very dire situation for the Russian military in Crimea. British intelligence pointed out that the main element of the Russian garrison, the 22nd Cause, has now mostly fled outside the peninsula and has suffered heavy losses. The majority of the fleeing soldiers belong to the 22nd Russian Cause. The 22nd Russian Cause is a unit of the coastal defense units of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy. Since last August, Russian military headquarters, airports, train tracks, logistics centers, fuel depots, and the Russian Navy base in Crimea have been the target of many attacks. As a result, while the Russian army doubled its troop presence in Crimea, it had to evacuate the people and their relatives in some regions. The atmosphere of fear and panic as a result of the attacks forced the Russians in the peninsula to sell their houses and flee. Many times there were queues of Russians fleeing the peninsula on the Kerch Bridge. Train and ferry services were filled with Russians fleeing in fear. This was one of the main aims of the Ukrainian attacks. It is estimated that around 350,000 Russian citizens have fled the peninsula so far. Are Ukrainian officials responsible for the Crimean region also confirmed this, but also state that it is insufficient. Evacuations, escapes, and the relocation of military formations to other regions paint the clearest picture of the tension and psychological collapse in Crimea. In addition to the Ukraine attack, anti-Kremlin, Russian partisan groups are also causing tension in the Crimea to rise. Russian volunteers announced a cross-border raid on occupied Crimea and spoke to the local population via radio. Radio stations in temporarily occupied Crimea announced the call, with Russia's Freedom Legion and militias planning to cross into Crimea shortly. In their announcement, the separatist Russians stated that they see it as their duty to help clear the peninsula from war criminal Putin. The Russian Freedom Legion and the Russian Volunteer Cause asked the people of Crimea to remain calm and help themselves as much as possible. These attacks on the Black Sea Peninsula stem from Ukraine's ideal of liberation. So how can Ukraine get Crimea back from Putin's hands? Ukraine has outlined a plan for how it can reclaim control of Crimea from Putin's hands. The plan includes dismantling the massive 19-kilometer bridge between Crimea and Russia, which has been dubbed Europe's longest bridge, located between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. Crimea is home to tens of thousands of deployed Russian soldiers and numerous Russian military bases. White House officials insist there has been no change in position. They state that Crimea belongs to Ukraine. In fact, the United States is one step closer to Putin's red line by saying the way to neutralize Crimea. The United States argues that Ukraine can seize Crimea without violence. US diplomats and many senior officials are suggesting the blockade option to curb Russian aggression. According to a former US diplomat, both countries are likely on the verge of launching new attacks. According to the diplomat, a blockade of Crimea from Russian aggression is a better option than the Ukrainian attempt to seize the region. The US diplomat is not alone in his views. Voices for Ukraine's blockade of Crimea are increasing. Retired US Army Europe Commander Ben Hodges has urged Kiev forces to isolate Crimea using long-range precision strikes. Hodges said drive back the Black Sea Fleet with daily precision strikes from Sevastopol. Do the same for the Russian Air Force at Saki. Ukraine can use low-cost explosive uncrewed surface ships for swarm attacks against Russian warships stationed in Sevastopol. The concept is simple: loaded with cameras, loaded with explosives. Low-profile missiles are aimed at targets. This emerging technology could sink warships and destroy naval infrastructure. The blockade approach could be part of a successful strategy to turn Crimea to Ukraine. It is not possible to predict when this strategy will be implemented. In another development, the attacks in Crimea caused the Kremlin to take some measures in Crimea. Satellite snapshots of Crimea reveal Russian coastal defenses that include dragon's teeth, trenches, and bunkers. Russia has transformed Crimea from a popular seaside resort into a military line of defense, with satellite images showing the peninsula overrun with anti-tank barriers and crisscrossed by reinforced trench nets. For starters, there are concrete dragon-teeth structures resembling pyramids along the coastline. Tanks and other military vehicles are specifically prohibited from passing through these buildings. There are several trenches on the peninsula that provide defense against incoming attackers behind the dragon's teeth. It's also possible to see numerous bunkers along the trenches that function as additional defensive positions. The presence of dragon's tooth stocks, excavation equipment, and piles of trees near the Crimean coastline indicate that construction work is ongoing. As a result, Crimea will always hang at one end of the war between Russia and Ukraine. How will the attacks on the Black Sea Peninsula shape the Ukraine war in the coming days? The great offensive operations of the Ukrainian armed forces continue at full speed. Within this plan, Ukrainian forces continue to blockade the Russians in the Zaporizhia region. Most recently, the Ukrainians carried out simultaneous offensive operations in the southwest and southeast of the city of Orikhiv. In this region, as a result of these attacks, Russian trenches were split in Vasilivka, southwest of Orikhiv, and Palahi, southeast of the city. Then the Ukrainians captured the city of Storozhev. This formed the basis of the link between Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, and the Ukrainians used this critical line of attack very well. As a result, Ukrainian forces in the Zaporizhia region continued their advance outside the city of Orikhiv. In addition, when the military convoy that the Russians sent as a support first to Orikhiv was stopped by the White Wolves Special Forces of Ukraine in Zapovittini, the Russian soldiers were helpless in the other front lines of both Orikhiv and Zaporizhia. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have recently turned Orikhiv into a strategy center in order to use the advantage they have gained effectively and shape their offensive axis. According to the situation in this city, while the northeastern lines of the city extended to the fronts in Donetsk, the southwestern direction was adjacent to critical areas such as Tokmak, Melitopol, and Kherson. So Orikhiv was a good strategic center chosen by the Ukrainians to direct the clashes in both Zaporizhia and Donetsk. With the blockade of the Russians in this city, it was predicted that the Ukrainian armed forces would organize a new offensive operation to the southwest of Orikhiv, that is to the Tokmak sides. Yes, fierce clashes have been going on in Tokmak for about a week, but these clashes were not a new offensive by Ukrainian forces, but rather actions by Ukrainian partisan and volunteer units. Of course, the military units of the Ukrainian army took part in these actions, but the Ukrainian army turned its offensive axis not to the southwest of Orikhiv, but to the northeast of the city. In this direction was the settlement of Blahodate, which is one of the targets of the Ukrainians. Ukrainian troops recently launched an incredible offensive operation to seize this city. After prolonged and violent clashes, Ukrainian forces succeeded in seizing the city. The Ukrainian military reported the successful recapture of the village of Blahodate in the eastern Donetsk region, marking a potential counter-offensive against Russian forces. Although the Ukrainian authorities have refrained from making the operation public, the withdrawal of Blahodate represents significant progress. The 68th Separate Hunting Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces posted a video on Facebook showing soldiers proudly flying the Ukrainian flag on a damaged building in the recaptured Blahodate. The Ukrainian ground forces confirmed in a separate social media post that the brigade had successfully recaptured Blahodate. Brigade spokesman Myroslav Semeniuk said an assault team had arrested 6 Russian soldiers as they entered several buildings where about 60 soldiers had taken refuge. The Russians then continued to bombard the Ukrainian forces in Blahodate. But this does not seem to stop Kiev's offensive plans because the Ukrainian armed forces announced that their next goal is to capture the village of Voruzhgany and plans to advance south. However, Western and Ukrainian leaders have consistently warned against undue rush, stressing that efforts to deport Russian forces more broadly will require significant time and strategic planning. So it remains important to be cautious as wider efforts to deport Russian troops are expected to take some time. On the other hand, while Russia continues to claim to repel the Ukrainian attacks, the withdrawal of Blahodate points to Ukraine striking advances on the Donetsk lines. Vladimir Rogov, an official commissioned by the Russians in the Zaporizhia region, claimed that Blahodate, along with 2 other villages in Zaporizhia, was in a contentious gray area for control. Rogov also claimed that Ukrainian forces briefly captured another village in the neighboring Donetsk region, but were quickly driven out by Russian troops. In other words, the big offensive plans of the Ukrainians continue simultaneously from critical regions such as Zaporizhia and Donetsk. Ukrainians continued to oppress other parts of the Donetsk front lines. Now, the Russians fear that the Ukrainian forces, after capturing Blahodate, will refocus on the Donetsk front lines. while the Zaporizhia region has been the center of clashes for about a few weeks. The Ukrainian success in Donetsk may justify the Russians' concerns. Russian leader Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, seems to have already taken action with the concern of this situation. Vladimir Putin is preparing to make moves to tighten control of the Wagner Group led by the businessman Yevgeny Prigozhin. It really reflects that Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu requests that Wagner Group troops sign contracts with the Russian Ministry by July the 1st is part of an effort to curb Prigozhin's independence. But Prigozhin refused Shoigu's order on this matter. His paramilitary unit played a critical role in Russia's efforts to capture the industrial city of Bakhmut in Ukraine's eastern region. He escalated public criticism of Russia's military leadership, including Shoigu, before his troops were withdrawn from Bakhmut this month. The Wagner leader accused Russian Defense Minister Shoigu of deliberately depriving his fighters of ammunition and support. Prigozhin also stated that these orders and decrees from Shoigu apply to employees of the Russian Ministry of Defense and military personnel, and that the Wagner Group will not sign any agreements with him. Prigozhin also published an alleged part of a letter from the Russian Ministry of Defense instructing Wagner and other volunteer military formations to inform the Joint Chief of Staff of the Russian Forces Group about the numbers of their forces, their reserves, and the supplies they received from the Russians. Later, Prigozhin claimed that his paramilitary group recruited 2.5 times more soldiers after provocative announcements that the Wagner private military companies should cease to exist. Also, Yevgeny Prigozhin claimed that the men signed up to join Wagner in order to avoid signing a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense. But the Russian Defense Ministry's efforts to formalize the Wagner Group were likely aimed at centralizing control of Russian irregular personnel and supplies and restricting Prigozhin's independence in response to the Ukrainian counter-offensive. It was also included that Viktor Sobolev, a member of the Russian State Duma Defense Committee, said that the Ministry of Defense could prohibit the Wagner Group from operating in Ukraine without first signing military contracts. Given that the Ukrainian forces have launched a new counterattack, one prominent Mil blogger claimed the timing of Shoigu's announcement was awkward. In fact, Mil bloggers were quite right about this. It would only be to Moscow's detriment if the Russian defense minister had withdrawn or not supported the Wagner mercenaries from the battlefield, while the Ukrainians had made such effective progress in both Donetsk and Zaporizhia. The fact that the Russian MOD prioritizes the bureaucratic elimination of Wagner instead of focusing on the counterattack may even lead to the Ukrainian victory in this war. But the Wagner Group's maverick doing whatever it wants on the battlefield could also upset Moscow's plans. Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who saw this critical point, took these critical steps through the Russian Ministry of Defense in order to control and regulate the Wagner Group. In the coming days, Putin wants to bring the mercenary group both psychologically and physically in order, as Wagner forces will be on the ground again to stop or slow the Ukrainian advance. You know, the Wagner forces put a lot of effort into Bakhmut. Now, this city is at risk for the Russians, with the Ukrainians turning their offensive axis back to the Donetsk front lines. Therefore, Putin must urgently spruce up the Wagner forces and drive this mercenary group back to the battlefield as reinforcements as soon as possible. If not, the Ukrainians' next move may be to take complete control of Bakhmut. In summary, the Ukrainians are getting closer and closer to a decisive victory in the admirable, large offensive operations. The Wagner rebellion continued and Prigozhin gradually consolidated control over the captured territories. If yesterday Wagner forces just crossed the border of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in multiple places and took control over the military objects in the Rostov region, then today, the Wagner forces reached the doorstep of Moscow. The rebellion started and developed so rapidly that many people seriously considered whether it is just a big show to distract the Ukrainians from their counter-operation. However, Today, the head of the Ukrainian intelligence, Budanov, confirmed that the internal Russian armed conflict is real and that removing the Russian Ministry of Defense is a matter of survival for Prigozhin. Today, Prigozhin released the video where he showed the captured headquarters of the Southern Military District. He effectively took captive the Russian commanders who were not allowed to leave and said that he would set everyone free in exchange for Shoigu and Gerasimov in order to increase the leverage. Prigozhin moved further and also captured the airfield and several villages east of the city and started reinforcing the flanks while moving towards Moscow. Putin gave a speech to address the situation, and despite the fact that Prigozhin claimed to be acting in the best Putin's interest, Putin did not support Prigozhin's actions. Putin called it a stab in the back that threatened to break Russia, just like it happened in 1917, which is why he ordered all special detachments to suppress the rebellion. He gave the Wagner soldiers the last chance to surrender and said that whoever remains will answer before the nation. Shortly, Russian forces started using their assault helicopters and fighter jets to bomb Wagner columns. Prigozhin said that Russian Air Force disregarded the fact that there were more civilian cars than Wagner cars and that pilots had turbo accuracy because everyone who could shoot was already on the front. Still, some bombs managed to hit the trucks on the road. One helicopter also blew up an oil depot in the Voronezh region, which by that time was also captured by the Wagner forces. Wagner forces responded reciprocally and started shooting down Russian aviation. The widely circulated footage confirms that Wagner forces managed to shoot down multiple aerial objects, including one assault helicopter, Kar-52, one multi-purpose helicopter, Mi-8, 3 electric warfare helicopters, 1 transport helicopter, and 1 aerial command point plane Il-18. Soon, Russian forces started bombing the occupied military headquarters in Rostov. Wagner forces responded by reinforcing the air defense in the region and asking civilians to evacuate from the area. Russian forces also tried to block the roads with trucks to complicate the movement of the Wagner forces. However, Wagner's just moved them to the side of the road. Sometimes Russian soldiers on the blog post did not welcome Wagner forces warmly, and there were violent confrontations. In general, Russian forces failed to provide reasonable resistance, and Wagner forces developed a presence not only in the Rostov and Voronezh regions, but also Kursk, Oryol, Lipetsk, Tambov, and Tula regions, reaching the doorstep of the Moscow region. Here, the situation became more complicated as the Russians blocked all the bridges. Simultaneously, the Chechen units entered the Rostov region to strike Wagner's flanks. The conflict was about to escalate, and after putting all cards on the table, the parties decided to try to negotiate. The president of Belarus, Lukashenko, volunteered to mediate the negotiations, in part because he has been a close friend of both Putin and Prigozhin for more than 20 years. Suddenly, Prigozhin announced that he was withdrawing. Russian officials stated that charges on Prigozhin and participated in Wagner soldiers were dropped. It looks like the Russian Ministry of Defense evaluated the situation and understood that they had no chance and fulfilled all of Prigozhin's demands, more precisely, the removal of Shoigu and Gerasimov. Even the Russian officials stated that no changes to the structure of the Ministry of Defense were discussed during the negotiation process. No one in the media space believes that it is expected that in order to avoid the escalation, Putin will remove the highest officials in the Russian Ministry of Defense over the course of around 2 months. Even though the turmoil inside the Russian Ministry of Defense is not explicit, it is happening, and the chaos inside the Russian war machine creates very favorable conditions for the Ukrainians. Prigozhin managed to succeed in this endeavor primarily because it was unexpected, and acting against expectations is a good idea not only in the combat zone,